Good morning and welcome back to our seminar series for epidemiology and community health. It's good to be back. This is the third Thursday of the month, which means it's an in-service for us. And again, we've defined our in-service seminars as those seminars that will help us do and be the type of division and public health practitioners and researchers that we want to be. So these are the ins and outs of making the work that we do and training our trainees to be able to be practitioners who can do this work moving forward. So not just higher level research topics, but really in the weeds of things. And so we're very, very fortunate to have Paul Robinson with us today. In fact, I won't be doing the introduction to Paul Robinson today because Diane knows him much better than I do. We have had the pleasure of having Paul come visit the faculty at least once or twice, but Diane knows him in different capacities, so she'll be giving the introduction. Just a few brief announcements before we begin. Of course, next week is our Thanksgiving break, and we hope that you all have a wonderful Thanksgiving and break. But following that, on December 3rd is Dr. Ellie Murray, who's zooming in from Boston University. She's an epidemiologist, and she'll be speaking about causal inference. So something that will be highly relevant to our epidemiology trainees, including the doctoral students and the postdocs in the program. She is an up-and-coming assistant professor in the field. She has a lot of social media presence, so a lot of people know her name. And so we would welcome you to come back in 2 weeks to hear Ellie's presentation. So without any more ado, I'd like to introduce Dr. Diane Newmark Steiner, of course, who is the division head of epidemiology and community health. Thanks, Diane.
Thanks, Ruby. So first of all, I want to start off by just giving a huge shout out to Ruby, who has really done a fantastic job with the seminar series this year. So thank you, Ruby. So yeah, I'm really, really thrilled to introduce Paul Robinson. Let me just start off by saying that as a division and as a school, we are very, very dedicated to diversity, equity, inclusion, anti-racism, and pursuing justice. And we have a DEI action team led by Tracy Toomey. And we have asked Paul Robinson, who will be our speaker today, to be our consultant. He's met with our faculty, he's met with me, he's met with our FEC, and he will be offering a leadership institute beginning in December. So we're really excited about that. We see it as a pilot, and hopefully we'll be offering future versions of that. I met Paul, it's probably about 8 or 9 years ago. And basically, I ran into someone who was a celloist, and she told me about the Shannon Leadership Institute. And she thought I would like it. And I thought, well, what do I have in common with a celloist? So I went to the orientation session, and I met Paul there. And some of you may have heard me repeat this, but I think it bears repeating, and some of you probably haven't heard me. And he started off by saying, we have our values that we need to identify, and we have how we lead and how we live our lives. And when those overlap completely, we have satisfaction. And when they don't overlap at all, we don't have satisfaction. So how can we lead and live our lives and work in a way so that we are guided by our values? And Paul, hopefully I got that right, but that was my interpretation, and that I have really used that in making many, many decisions in my own life. And hopefully within our division, people are also thinking about that. So Paul works tirelessly in leadership and in pursuing justice. He does this in his work as a pastor. He does this as a consultant for Joyful Leadership and Consulting, which he founded and leads. And he does this through his work at the Shannon Leadership Institute. It's an honor to have him here today. And Paul, I would love for you to share with us a bit about your work and the work that you were talking about when we were first getting going, and then dive into the topic. Thank you for joining us.
Great. Thank you so much, Diane, for the warm introduction, and Ruby for hosting. Ruby has such a calming voice. Great way to start the morning. Thank you. Yeah, as Diane said, I've committed a good portion of my life to the work of advancing justice and helping to make our communities more equitable for all of our citizens. So I do that in my day job. I do that in my consulting practice, where I combine the competencies of good leadership development with diversity, equity, and inclusion and anti-racist work. As a practitioner, I'm committed to not only helping individuals be on their own journey, but also helping organizations create the type of culture where people can bring their full selves to their work, and where they can flourish, and where they can be better representatives of an increasingly diverse and multi-ethnic world that we live in. So I'm excited to be able to be with you today, and I'm really looking forward to our Equity Leadership Institute. So today we've just got about an hour, less than an hour now. So today will be just a teaser of some of the things that we will address. But I've entitled this Workplace Intercultural Agility. So I'm gonna share my screen, and then we're gonna get started. Let's see. All right, so let me see. All right, so just start with our agenda. We're gonna do some brief definitions, not go too deep in that. Look at a little research around the value of being interculturally agile from an organizational standpoint. Gonna look at a little video. It's a little dated now, but in terms of the message, it's still very relevant today. And then we'll turn the corner and kind of look at some tools, right? How we can become more of cultural learners as opposed to cultural critics. I'll give you a little tool that kind of helps us in that regard to build that muscle around being a cultural learner. And then we'll save some time at the end for Q&A. All right, so let's just start with this definition, just a basic definition of culture. When we think about culture, we think about, the customary beliefs, social forms, and material traits of racial, religious, or social groups. And certainly when you think about an institution like the University of Minnesota, there's organizational culture. Lots of organizations have culture, families have culture, and there is, real realities to that, but the definition that I like to use when I talk about culture is a little bit more specific, right? It gets down to the individual, and it's the composition of an individual's background, perspectives, values, and beliefs. So when you think about how each of us as individuals, we have culture, right? You can have members of the same family, born to the same parents who are completely different, right? Part of the reason why we have sibling rivalries, right? So culture is one of these fascinating kind of things, and I like to get it down to the root, right? Before we start talking about the larger cultural communities that we're a part of. We want to recognize, appreciate, and value the complexity, right? And the depth and the beauty of our own individual culture. So that's the starting point for our conversation today. and in the Equity Leadership Institute, we'll be starting with the individual. I really believe that it's important for us to be on our own journey, right? To be learning and growing in terms of our own diversity, equity, inclusion, and anti-racist identities. And then we can contribute to the larger communities that we're a part of, the cultures that we're a part of, where we work and where we serve, and where we volunteer. Okay. All right, so let's define intercultural agility. What are we talking about when we talk about intercultural agility? We're talking about this capacity to be able to create new cultural spaces and facilitate win-win solutions or situations by correctly interpreting and adjusting to the culturally defined behaviors of others. This is really important. This is this capacity to bridge across cultural differences, to be able to flex and to adapt and to, well, first understand, but then flex and adapt to what's required in that cultural moment. That's what it means to be interculturally agile. And this is increasingly more and more important as our world is more and more diverse. Okay, so let's look at a little research. Again, this is a little dated now. This goes back to 2000, but J.J. Stefano did some research, and this research shows essentially that multicultural, it's not good enough just to have a multicultural team, which is fascinating because sometimes we think that diversity is the solution. No, diversity is the step toward a solution, which is ultimately inclusion. But just having multicultural teams is not good enough. If the multicultural team is not led by leaders that are multicultural or intercultural in their thinking, right? So they actually lag behind. Multicultural teams can lag behind monocultural teams when the leader of those teams suppress cultural differences, when cultural differences become an obstacle to performance. But note what happens through this research when you have a multicultural team, a diverse team, where the leader of the team acknowledges and supports cultural differences and celebrates cultural differences and sees these differences as assets to performance, you actually see that multicultural teams outperform monocultural teams. And so there's been quite a bit of research on the value of really leveraging diversity as opposed to avoiding it or ignoring it. Now, I'll be honest with you, and you've probably discovered this yourself, when you work with lots of different people, with lots of different ideas, from lots of different perspectives, it's messy and it takes longer. But the research shows that if you can live in that tension, you can live in that messiness, you're going to get a better outcome. You're going to get a better experience on the other side. All right, let's take a look at a little video, and we're going to talk a little bit about it on the other side.
I'm a storyteller, and I would like to tell you a few personal stories about what I like to call the danger of the single story. I grew up on a university campus in eastern Nigeria. My mother says that I started reading at the age of 2, although I think 4 is probably close to the truth. So I was an early reader, and what I read were British and American children's books. I was also an early writer, and when I began to write at about the age of 7, stories in pencil with crayon illustrations that my poor mother was obligated to read, I wrote exactly the kinds of stories I was reading. All my characters were white and blue-eyed. They played in the snow. They ate apples. And they talked a lot about the weather, how lovely it was that the sun had come out. Now, this despite the fact that I lived in Nigeria. I had never been outside Nigeria.
Sorry about that.
didn't have snow, we ate mangoes, and we never talked about the weather because there was no need to. My characters also drank a lot of ginger beer because the characters in the British books I read drank ginger beer. Never mind that I had no idea what ginger beer was. And for many years afterwards, I would have a desperate desire to taste ginger beer. But that is another story. What this demonstrates, I think, is how impressionable and vulnerable we are in the face of a story, particularly as children. Because all I had read were books in which characters were foreign, I had become convinced that books, by their very nature, had to have foreigners in them and had to be about things with which I could not personally identify. Now, things changed when I discovered African books. There weren't many of them available, and they weren't quite as easy to find as the foreign books, but because of writers like Chinua Achebe and Kamaralaye, I went through a mental shift in my perception of literature. I realized that people like me, girls with skin the color of chocolate, whose kinky hair could not form ponytails, could also exist in literature. I started to write about things I recognized. Now, I loved those American and British books I read. They stirred my imagination. They opened up new worlds for me. But the unintended consequence was that I did not know that people like me could exist in literature. So what the discovery of African writers did for me was this. It saved me from having a single story of what books are. I come from a conventional middle-class Nigerian family. My father was a professor. My mother was an administrator. And so we had, as was the norm, living domestic help who would often come from nearby rural villages. So the year I turned 8, we got a new houseboy. His name was Fide. The only thing my mother told us about him was that his family was very poor. My mother sent yams and rice and our old clothes to his family. And when I didn't finish my dinner, my mother would say, "Finish your food. Don't you know people like Fide's family have nothing?" So I felt enormous pity for Fide's family. Then one Saturday, we went to his village to visit. And his mother showed us a beautifully patterned basket made of dyed raffia that his brother had made. I was startled. It had not occurred to me that anybody in his family could actually make something. All I had heard about them was how poor they were, so that it had become impossible for me to see them as anything else but poor. Their poverty was my single story of them. Years later, I thought about this when I left Nigeria to go to university in the United States. I was 19. My American roommate was shocked by me. She asked where I had learned to speak English so well and was confused when I said that Nigeria happened to have English as its official language. She asked if she could listen to what she called my tribal music and was consequently very disappointed when I produced my tape of Mariah Carey. She assumed that I did not know how to use a stove. What struck me was this. She had felt sorry for me even before she saw me. Her default position toward me, as an African, was a kind of patronizing, well-meaning pity. My roommate had a single story of Africa, a single story of catastrophe. In this single story, there was no possibility of Africans being similar to her in any way, no possibility of feelings more complex than pity, no possibility of a connection as human equals. So after I had spent some years in the US as an African, I began to understand my roommate's response to me. If I had not grown up in Nigeria, and if all I knew about Africa were from popular images, I too would think that Africa was a place of beautiful landscapes, beautiful animals, and incomprehensible people fighting senseless wars, dying of poverty and AIDS, unable to speak for themselves, and waiting to be saved by a kind white foreigner. I would see Africans in the same way that I, as a child, had seen Fide's family. And so I began to realize that my American roommate must have, throughout her life, seen and heard different versions of this single story. As had a professor who once told me that my novel was not authentically African. Now, I was quite willing to contend that there were a number of things wrong with the novel, that it had failed in a number of places, but I had not quite imagined that it had failed at achieving something called African authenticity. In fact, I did not know what African authenticity was. The professor told me that my characters were too much like him, an educated and middle-class man. My characters drove cars. They were not starving. Therefore, they were not authentically African. So that is how to create a single story. Show a people as one thing, as only one thing, over and over again, and that is what they become. It is impossible to talk about the single story without talking about power. There is a word, an Igbo word, that I think about whenever I think about the power structures of the world, and it is nkali. It's a noun that loosely translates to be greater than another. Like our economic and political worlds, stories too are defined by the principle of nkali. How they are told, who tells them, when they are told, how many stories are told, are really dependent on power. Power is the ability not just to tell the story of another person, but to make it the definitive story of that person. The Palestinian poet Mourid Barghouti writes that if you want to dispossess a people, the simplest way to do it is to tell their story and to start with secondly. Start the story with the arrows of the Native Americans and not with the arrival of the British, and you have an entirely different story. Start the story with the failure of the African state and not with the colonial creation of the African state, and you have an entirely different story. I recently spoke at a university where a student told me that it was such a shame that Nigerian men were physical abusers like the father character in my novel. I told him that I had just read a novel called American Psycho, and that it was such a shame that young Americans were serial murderers. Now, obviously, I said this in a fit of mild irritation, but it would never have occurred to me to think that just because I had read a novel in which a character was a serial killer, that he was somehow representative of all Americans. And now this is not because I'm a better person than that student, but because of America's cultural and economic power, I had many stories of America. I had read Thailand, Updike, and Steinbeck, and Gateskill. I did not have a single story of America. All of these stories make me who I am. But to insist on only these negative stories is to flatten my experience and to overlook the many other stories that formed me. The single story creates stereotypes, and the problem with stereotypes is not that they are untrue, but that they are incomplete. They make one story become the only story. I've always felt that it is impossible to engage properly with a place or a person without engaging with all of the stories of that place and that person. The consequence of the single story is this: it robs people of dignity. It makes our recognition of our equal humanity difficult. It emphasizes how we are different rather than how we are similar. What if my mother had told us that Fide's family was poor and hardworking? What if we had an African television network that broadcast diverse African stories all over the world, what the Nigerian writer Chinua Achebe calls a balance of stories? I went to a TV station in Lagos to do an interview, and a woman who worked there as a messenger came up to me and said, "I really liked your novel. I didn't like the ending. Now you must write a sequel, and this is what will happen." And she went on to tell me what to write in the sequel. Now, I was not only charmed, I was very moved. Here was a woman, part of the ordinary masses of Nigerians who were not supposed to be readers. She had not only read the book, but she had taken ownership of it and felt justified in telling me what to write in the sequel. Stories matter. Many stories matter. Stories have been used to dispossess and to malign, but stories can also be used to empower and to humanize. Stories can break the dignity of a people, but stories can also repair that broken dignity.
Okay, great. So I want us to have a little conversation. This is Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie, who did this TED Talk. I cut it down for the sake of our conversation today. It's about twice as long as this. But I wanted us to just for a few minutes talk a little bit about some of the things that she shared. What are your thoughts about some of the single stories that you are aware of, or that you've heard of, or maybe that you've heard about your tribe or your culture? What are some of the real challenges that we're facing as it relates to what I would call an increasingly troublesome effort on a part of some to just listen to the story of their group or tribe, right? In other words, some of our fracturing and our division is because we seem to be increasingly only interested in stories that reinforce our own narratives, as opposed to being open to the stories of others. So just some general thoughts. I usually do a breakout for this, but we don't have time for a breakout, but let's just maybe entertain any thoughts about this little TED Talk and the whole notion of the danger of a single story.
Paul, would you be okay if people just simply unmuted themselves and spoke, or would you like to call?
Yes.
Just
If you have
unmute,
something to
unmute.
say, unmute and jump in. It's just like a family reunion, so you don't have to raise your hand or anything, because I can't see everybody anyways. Anyone?
I'll say something.
All right, Lisa.
So yeah, it was really great to see that and think about how it's so tempting to generalize when you meet somebody. So I'm white. I grew up in rural Minnesota. So that's my tribe, is people in rural Minnesota. And I can see that there's, amongst my city friends, the assumption that rural people are all Trump supporters and uneducated. And so, but I know the more rich stories of all the different kinds of people who live in rural Minnesota. So that's an example of where I can see that single narrative playing out.
That's great. Thank you for sharing that. Where do you think single stories come from? How are they created? Anyone want to take a stab at that?
I think we do. Go ahead. Did I jump in? I think we do. I'm from a small town in North Dakota, and in North Dakota, the generalization is we know everybody and everything about everybody, and we can relate to everybody, and that's just not. And we can see everyone's story, and that's just not the case. So I think it comes from our own tribes, kind of, and then just one single event, perhaps, or I don't know.
Yeah, I think sometimes the stories are based on myths that are basically perpetuated, especially perceptions about the other. And they get handed down from, one generation to the other, but they have no basis in reality. They really are kind of myths that that have been created over time and perpetuated, and that really create inequalities.
Kind of makes me think about how epidemiologists, we might contribute to it a bit sometimes, because we will say like 60% of people are this way. And then we might think, so everybody is like that, but 60% is not everybody, so it's more complex, and we sometimes simplify our data in ways that contribute to this.
Yeah, that's great. Go ahead.
In the disability community, I think it's interesting that some of it, I think, comes from, dare I say it, a good place. I mean, pity is robbing people of humanity. I absolutely believe that. But I think sometimes it's also about, feeling or compassion, but then reduced down to a single story that can rob people of their humanity.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think those are great contributions. I think Chimamanda's comments about power are very important, because I think the power of dominant cultures to set narratives, or you might say stereotypes or perceptions about non-dominant groups, we can't ignore that. And so when you have the power to mass produce an idea and to market it widely and to saturate the airwaves, tell it in stories, tell it in books, tell it on, TV shows and print media, over time, those stories can stick and become true, particularly, as she said, when you don't have a diversity of stories. And so I think that's something we have to really pay attention to and try to diversify our understanding of differences by exposing ourselves to different sources. I think is a great practice. Okay, anything else on this TED Talk before we move on? Anybody else want to share?
I guess I thought it was interesting, and usually when I've heard people talk about, I guess, the single story and how people are presented in a certain light, it's from a perspective of that's how people see this group. But she started her talk, or where we started the video, she was telling a story about how she had been subject to that narrative. And so I think that allowed me at least to reflect and be like, oh yeah, that's happened to me a few times, versus starting out by saying, like, look at how these people see those people in just one way. And then you immediately don't want to associate yourself as part of that, because it's clear that it's such a wrong viewpoint, but the way she introduced it made it very approachable. So
yes. Thank you for that observation, Eleanor. And I think it speaks well to what we're going to talk about next, because Chimamanda comes at this subject from the place of being a cultural learner as opposed to a cultural critic. And we're going to talk a little bit about that. So I'm going to share my screen again. Let's see. Okay, so we're going to talk a little bit about cultural critics versus cultural learners. So this is a bit of the material from the ICI, which is short for Intercultural Intelligence. I'm a qualified administrator for the ICI, and I'll be incorporating some of those resources in our Equity Leadership Institute. And this is a concept from that resource. So cultural critics tend to observe from above, and they view other people's cultures as not being as good as their own. Whereas cultural learners observe from within. and they try to understand the underlying beliefs and reasons for behavior. So let's look at the profile of these. Cultural critics, I'm not going to read all of these, but cultural critics tend to own culture or have a view, a lens that their own culture is experienced as the only real one. That they may be threatened by cultural differences and could act aggressively to eliminate them. Cultural critics tend to have a notion of we are superior and they are inferior. Cultural critics tend to be highly critical of other cultures. Cultural critics, they may trivialize or romanticize other cultures. So these are just kind of a few things. Of course, there's exceptions always to everything, but this is just a general profile of the mindset when we come at differences from a cultural critic point of view or worldview. Now, this is juxtaposed with the thinking or the lens of cultural learners. Cultural learners experience their own culture as one of a number of equally complex constructs. In other words, your own culture is not seen as above or below another culture. It's seen on par. It's just different. It's not above or below. Cultural learners tend to be curious about and respectful toward cultural differences. Cultural learners tend to be able to express perceptions and behaviors appropriate to other cultures. Cultural learners have this or are working on this adaptive quality where they may intentionally change behavior to communicate more effectively. Cultural learners tend to be comfortable among minorities, expatriates, and global nomads. Again, not always, but this is the general lens or profile and worldview. And cultural learners have developed strong cultural acquisition competency. So cultural acquisition speaks to your ability to better understand, to bridge, and to navigate across cultural differences, right? And cultural learners have the ability to look at the world through different eyes. Okay, so if you want to know more about cultural learners and cultural critics, you want to sign up for the Equity Leadership Institute. All right, so what are some tools? How can we become more adept at being cultural learners as opposed to being cultural critics? So one of the tools that the ICI offers is this whole notion of the 3 A's, or becoming aware, learning to accept, and learning to adapt. So becoming aware is about intentionally noticing and paying attention. It's about being aware of your own emotions, your own attitudes, your own biases. Chimamanda talked about how she became aware based on the framing of her parents that she had a bias toward Fide's family, right? That she could only see them through the lens of being poor. But once she actually had something that I think is also important for us, proximity, right? Because she was in relationship, she got a chance to meet Fide's family, right? She became aware of the complexity and the richness of that particular family, right? So when we're becoming aware, it's an intentional noticing, it's a slowing down. It's the ability to kind of disrupt some of the typical patterns and narratives that we may have learned by leaning in. So it's being aware of our own emotions, attitudes, and biases, but it's also taking in information and taking in facts that help you understand the emotions, attitudes, and biases of others. Okay. The second tool is to accept. Second A is accept. So accepting is, in this context, it simply means accepting that the situation is the way that it is. A great deal of making peace with the situation is recognizing the difference between what you can control and what you can't, as well as what needs to be changed and what doesn't need to be changed, right? Acceptance is being able to embrace the facts as they stand, what you can control, what you can't control, and what needs to be changed and what doesn't need to be changed. And then the final A is adaptation. Adaptation is about flexing. It's about that intercultural agility that's necessary. And adapting doesn't mean that you have to compromise your values or change your beliefs. It does mean, though, that you learn a different way of doing things and a different way of communicating. It's what the ICI talks about, creating a third cultural space. A third cultural space because every individual has culture. They're part of a culture, and maybe many cultures, but creating a third space is about really taking that individual, taking that person as an individual, and not assuming that just because they're a particular group, or member of a particular group, that they also necessarily own the characteristics and profiles of that group. The most effective communication, of course, is what achieves the desired outcome. So when we're adaptable, we're able to flex and to discover and to pursue the right pathway for the best particular communication. So some of you have seen The Wizard of Oz. Some of you have seen The Wiz. They're both great films. But I think The Wiz is a great example of this 3 A's, right? In terms of how Dorothy learns to become aware of her new reality. She accepts it and then she adapts. So the classic line that everybody knows from The Wiz is, you know, I'm not in Kansas anymore. So she became aware that, you know, things were changed. Her environment was changed. It was different, and it was going to require an embracing of her new environment, her new surroundings, her new companions and compatriots, if she was going to be successful in her goal, you know, to get back home. And of course, along this journey, she meets some very interesting characters, and she's helpful to them in terms of their goals and dreams, but also ultimately realizes that what she needs, she already has. But a good example of how this idea of awareness, acceptance, and adaptation can be a tool to kind of help us navigate differences. And if anybody ever had to navigate differences, it was certainly Dorothy from The Wiz. Okay. So I want to save us some time for Q&A, and Alvin Toffler, who you know is a futurist. He's an American writer, businessman. He is committed to talking about the digital revolution and the communication revolution. Says the illiterate of the 21st century will not be those who cannot read and write, but those who cannot learn, unlearn, and relearn. All right, so let's just have a little conversation here, some Q&A. We could talk about cultural learners versus cultural critics, We could talk about the 3 A's or anything else that comes to mind related to how we might apply some of these tools within the context of your division.
Yeah, I was actually starting to put some in the chat, but I thought I would just go ahead and say it. It just seems that, you know, we might view cultural learners and cultural critics as 2 ends of a continuum, right? Because people may be at different stages of awareness and growth. So it's not a kind of either or, right? I'm just wondering how you see these. So you could be anywhere along that continuum, but the idea is to move people, you know, basically towards being, you know, cultural learners, essentially. Is that kind of the goal?
Absolutely, that's a good point. And that depending upon an event or a circumstance, you know, you could be on any side of that, right? So you could generally be a cultural learner, but you could have a bad cultural experience. Mm-hmm. And your response might be more categorized as a cultural critic. Or you could be a cultural critic, generally speaking, right? But have a very positive cultural experience, right? Where your response may show up more in the cultural learner category. So yes, it's a very fluid, we move back and forth, but I think I offer it, you know, as a construct and as a tool to, you know, here's some things that I want to work on, right? I want to be open. I want to learn. I don't want to judge a culture from outside. I want to try to have some proximity to people from different cultures and form my own opinions as opposed to adopting a stereotype or bias that's set by the dominant culture, right? That's the posture really of a cultural learner. Or not assume that, you know, what's been said about a particular group or a narrative, or to Chimamanda's point, a single story is the only story about that group, right? Is there something else? I talk a lot about in cultural competency work, the importance of developing a strong curiosity muscle, right? You all are educators, so you're very curious people. Well, as in culture, you have to also be curious, right? You have to have a posture of wanting to know and to discover and to learn and to be bold and to move outside of your comfort zone. And it's in that pursuit of more knowledge that you have more data. And when you have more data, right, you have more things that you can actually act on and be more agile in terms of bridging across cultural differences. Great.
Oh, I have a question. So it's true, we are an educational environment and a research environment. So we, you know, are curious and we want to learn and we read and we ask questions. And yet in this area, I find that something else is going on. And it's either that people are afraid to ask questions because they're afraid of seeming ignorant or being critiqued by their peers or getting it wrong, or they're not interested. And I don't know, maybe other people who are on this call can comment about your perceptions, but I struggle with that as a leader. And I'm wondering if you have advice.
Yeah. Well, I'll speak to the first point. I think the fear is very real in lots of institutions and organizations. And I think the fear comes from a larger cultural effort that's been underway for quite some time, hundreds of years, really, in a racialized society where the elephant in the room we really don't talk about, right? Many of the things that, you know, we're trying to make people aware of as it relates to difference, culture, having an anti-racist mindset, come as new things to people because these aren't things we actually learn in school. We're not taught about these things. We don't really get a good education as it relates to cultural differences, or even, you know, the history of race in this country. You know, it's ironic that we're having this debate about critical race theory when the truth is that there are no theories being taught about race, critical race or otherwise. You know, in school, we might get a unit on Dr. King and Rosa Parks, maybe. But we aren't doing any work in this area. So when an institution says, hey, this is important to us, this is being culturally competent and being interculturally agile is as important to your job as your trained discipline. So that naturally for some is going to create some fear because they're less competent. They haven't had the conversation. They haven't had the training. They haven't had the dialogue. They haven't been invited to do this work. And so that may prevent some from actually engaging the conversation, right? If I'm silent, you know, maybe I can pass as it relates to this particular subject matter. But I also think you're right that some folks are disinterested. It's not important to them because it's not hitting them directly, which I think is unfortunate. Because if we all are members of the human race, we know race, as we understand it, is a sociological construct, but we all are members of the human race, then we should be concerned about the deleterious impact that some members of different tribes are having. Even if we're not having that direct experience, it should concern us that, you know, there are people who are living in poverty, that there are people who are, you know, on our borders trying to have a better life for themselves, that, you know, there are lots of people who, you know, don't have advanced degrees. In fact, don't even graduate from high school. So we should have a concern about people who are having different experiences than we're having. And when we don't have that concern, it's often because we lack proximity to those people. We don't actually have stories and experiences with people who are different than us. And so then we can distance ourselves from it. And we often see incredible transformation in people when they actually have an experience, right? They can actually be transformed and become advocates because it happens to them or it happens to someone close to them, right? You know, back in the 80s, I'll give this quick example. I know we're running out of time. Back in the 80s when we were having the crack cocaine crisis in America, or actually, and then it was called an epidemic, right? It was largely the phenomenon of inner city America, right? And the victims were largely Black and brown people, right? Now, fast forward to the 2000s, and now we have an opioid crisis. And the opioid crisis is not called an epidemic. And you've got politicians talking about we need to do something about it. Why? We have to do something about it now because majority people, white people, are being impacted, right? And so now it's something that we've got to do something about. It's a public health concern. When it was those people, the message was lock them up. When it's our people, it's get them help. And so that disinterest can come from a lack of proximity. Okay, I've talked too long. That's four minutes left. Anyone else?
This is Jamie Slaughter. I just want to thank you for that description between the, crack cocaine epidemic and the opioid crisis, because I think for a lot of people of color, they, especially in public health, they have to work to hold on to or to have empathy, right, for those affected by the opioid crisis because of the lack of empathy and humanity that was used in the crack cocaine epidemic, right? So I think we have to be cognizant that hurt begets hurt, right?
Yeah.
And that the answer is not necessarily to cut off compassion or empathy, right? But I don't know, to learn or I don't know, rise above, go, don't go low.
Go high, as
But I
Michelle
think
was
that's
saying.
important.
Yeah. Yeah. But I think it's not good enough. Thank you for that. It's not good enough for us to just respond. We actually have to tell the story. We have to be in dialogue about how these are essentially the same thing. People getting strung out. The only difference is the color of the people getting strung out. So yes, we need to address it. We need to be compassionate. We need to put, the resources to it, but we also need to be having a dialogue about how we responded has been in a racialized way. That we have used public resources and allocated those public resources really based on who we think is most important in a society. And that is not consistent with our Constitution or our values as a society. Our stated values, anyway. Okay, we got about a minute. Anybody else want to get one last thought in? All right, hearing none, just want to thank everybody for showing up today, and I hope you got a little something to provoke you, and hopefully you'll continue to engage these conversations and be on your own journey of being a cultural learner.
So I just really want to thank Paul. Another thing that he always talked about was engaging in nutritious conversation. And you gave us a lot of material for nutritious conversation. So thank you so much, Paul, and look forward to learning more from you. And people should know that Paul is working with our division. You can feel free to reach out to him for work-related questions around making our environment as good as we can get it. Thank you so much.
Wonderful. Thank you, Paul.
You're welcome. I just put my email in the chat. All right. Have a great weekend.
Thank you.
All right. Bye-bye.